About a womanizing con man who is shot at the beginning in the opening, and he doesn't know which of the women that he's been deceiving is the one that shot him because they all
Hmm.
have the same first name. I thought it was clever, but I was 15.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Elmore Leonard podcast. This is Judd Rubin. Today, we are thrilled to get to talk to C.M. Kushins, author of Cooler Than Cool, the Elmore Leonard biography that will be coming out in October on what would be Elmore's 100th birthday. We're super excited to get to talk to you, Chad. Before we dig into the biography and how you got involved in writing it, I thought it'd be interesting if you could give us just a little reminder of the breadth and the scope of Elmore's spectacular life and career.
I really appreciate that, Judd. Thank you so much for having me. And this is one of the few topics where I am very comfortable talking at great length. I have loved Elmore Leonard since I'm about 11 years old. It was a great pleasure to write his biography because I think it's actually a relatively important story, especially if you are a lover of American literature or an aspiring or professional writer yourself. His life story and his career is very inspiring. He is known today primarily for some of the bestsellers that he wrote during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Most listeners would probably recognize the titles of his greatest bestsellers and the feature films that were made out of them, such as Get Shorty, Out of Sight. Quentin Tarantino's film Jackie Brown was based on one of Elmore's bestsellers, Rum Punch.
Sure.
And really, yeah, and most recently, FX's TV series Justified, which was a smash hit and even had a spin-off sequel, City Primeval, is based on a recurring character, a fan favorite of Elmore's. That's Raylan Givens, the U.S. Marshal. But Elmore started as really one of the last great pulp writers. He had started in the 1950s while working as an ad man, getting up early in the morning to write his first few westerns. And he cracked the pulp genre earlier on in the 1950s into the 1960s, almost exclusively writing westerns. And that was something that he was inspired by as a fan himself, but he was also really inspired by really great literature and the things he had been reading. One of his earliest heroes had been Ernest Hemingway.
Mm.
And he had said this often, that he considered For Whom the Bell Tolls to have been a Western, and taught himself really how to write primarily based on that. So the Western market was a place where he could really hone his skills and kind of woodshed to become a serious writer while getting paid. And Elmore did this until he had some success in 1957. Two of his stories, one novel and one of his novellas, not only went and became films, but they became classic films.
Mm.
310 to Yuma is probably the biggest one that people would remember.
The first adaptation of 310 to Yuma.
That was the first adaptation. The film itself has become such a classic that even then it was remade in 2005, big budget Hollywood remake. But that's how far his career goes back, that lineage of both the old westerns and the film adaptations, which he's primarily known for. Now, they say that he had a hiatus from fiction in the 1960s, but he was really concentrating on his personal life and his family while honing his skills once again to develop a more modern narrative voice. Westerns had lost popularity in TV and in book sales, and most of the pulp magazines he had made his name with had dried up. So in 1969, he wrote his first contemporary crime novel, The Big Bounce.
Mm.
It was immediately turned into a film that he despised, which had started a very famous love-hate relationship with many of the adaptations of his work. But as a recourse, he became a screenwriter himself. And starting in 1970, he was both a successful screenwriter and developed that voice into one of the most successful crime fiction writers in American history. By the time of Elmore's passing in 2013, the majority of everything he had ever written had either been adapted or was optioned for film and television. And out of a whole career of awards for his work, it was capped off right before his passing with a Lifetime Achievement National Book Award.
Wow.
So this is a guy who really transcended genre, and I think is one of the last great true American novelists. as an outgrowth of the pulp tradition and Hemingway and a lot of the progressive themes that he was able to infuse over the course of the decades. So I think anybody that is very serious about writing or just loves a good story, Elmore's entire bibliography can teach a lot about how to put words on the page and really communicate with your reader. And I think that that's what gives it universal themes. And I think that his characters are kind of, let's see, immortal because he had made them so real with the style in which he worked.
Obviously, Elmore is very well known for his dialogue. Characterization through dialogue is, I think, maybe a better way to look at it. His
Oh, yeah.
characters are so well rounded, so real, and so true to themselves that even when you're reading a book that was written 50 or at this point 60 years ago, it feels modern. It feels like this person could be someone that I know. I understand what's going on with him. His grasp of human nature and behavior is really exceptional. I'm lucky enough to have been able to read a advanced copy of the biography. It is terrific, and I don't want to say so much about Elmore that people don't think that they don't need to go buy the biography. But and so I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit about your path, your journey, about how you got to write the biography, and you've written other biographies, and we could talk about some of those. But maybe you could just speak briefly about some of the things that drew you to him as a human being, in addition to as an artist.
Absolutely. Those were all very valid points that you made. I mean that. One of the things that was wonderful about researching the life and the work of Elmore Leonard, I'm very fortunate, very blessed that this was my third book. And I have written two biographies prior to that. My first one is Nothing's Bad Luck, the lives of Warren Zevon. And the second was Beast, John Bonham and the Rise of Led Zeppelin. I'm a musician myself, I'm a big rock fan. But the thing that I loved about writing about Elmore, who has been my hero since I'm about 11 years old, is I not only was really blessed that for the first time it was an authorized biography and I got to know his family, they're amazing, but it was one of those instances where some of the biggest revelations about the person that you're writing about is actually what a good person they were in their personal life. You don't get to have that experience very often. And I really believe that Elmore, the quality of Elmore Leonard's work, I believe this, is that it was he enjoyed doing it.
Mm.
He had worked for decades in order to reach a point where he could almost sit and have like a flow state because he enjoyed the act of writing. You know, Judd, he was very famous for writing all of his manuscripts traditionally by hand, about 3 or 4 pages at a time before putting them on the typewriter and then giving them to his daughter Jane for proper typesetting. But I think one of the things about what you had said, the characterization and the humanity and how his dialogue rings true, is that he really said many times he let the characters dictate where the story would go. And I've always thought that there's something really beautiful and symbolic how he would write by pen and let these voices kind of become people in his mind. I honestly think it's the reason that his characters always behave the way that you would expect them to once you get to know them. It's very unique to any writer when you actually see that the characters evolve and their characterization is so accurate psychologically in the way that they behave. He playfully would say that they wrote themselves, and I think that that was very modest, but that was a skill set that he really developed over time, developing his ear. And personally, I think one of the things, whether he would say it or not, I think Elmore also knew that people in general, over time periods, don't really change. So you
Mm.
could read one of his early westerns, then you could read one of his incredible historical novels. There's a handful of them. You know, he did Cuba Libre. The Hot Kid is one of my absolute favorites, the Prohibition era.
Same, same.
Oh, I love it. But the thing is that, you know, the characters, the patois and everything is heavily researched. There's nothing that's out of place in the terminology. But people are either really good or really bad to each other at whatever phase of history. And I think part of his point is the way people deal with each other. And a big recurring theme that he always had, no matter what era he was writing about, was criminals and law enforcement and the dynamic between the two of them. And it never really changed between the Old West and modern Detroit. So I think there's a lot to find in any one of his books if you pick it up because his themes never really change. He was always making that point.
You mentioned Hemingway as a writer he learned from and looked up to and admired. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the other writers he admired and learned from, and a little bit about some of the writers and other artists today who are clearly paying homage to him and his style.
Sure. No, I would be happy to. That was one of the things, and this is one of the very, very rare instances in my life where it's a tiny bit of living proof. The thing that I admire about Elmore, and I didn't realize this until writing his actual biography and doing this type of deep dive into his life and work, is that he kind of was the opposite of what you would see with like the Wizard of Oz. This is a person who had no problems lifting the veil and talking about his process and inspiring other people to want to write and to want them to learn from the joy that he got out of it. It's very evident in how he talked about it. Hemingway was the number one writer that he would always talk about earliest in his career. But it is fascinating that, his father traveled for business quite a bit. So he was raised largely by his mother and his older sister, who would read to him as a child. And his mother belonged to the Book of the Month Club.
Mm.
Now, it seems like, where is this going? Well, he was a very, not mischievous, but inquisitive kid. And he was developing his ear for dialogue at a very young age, listening to his sister and then reenacting scenes and things like that. And I think when he was in the military, he was stationed in the Philippines during World War II when he started to get the writing bug. But he read Hemingway, he read the stuff, all the classics that would come from his mother with the Book of the Month Club. And then you would get a lot of the adventure and guy fiction that was aimed towards the soldiers that were overseas. When he came back, he started pretty much doing a deep dive into the classics. And he minored in philosophy, which I don't think is a small thing when it comes to really how he nailed his characters later. The biggest influence, I mean, there were many other writers that did influence him during that time, but he was primarily developing his own ear. He said that he loved John D. MacDonald at the time as well. That was one author. He didn't read a lot of westerns. The biggest famous change in his writing style that people have noted, and it is an important one, is that by the time 1970 rolled around, Elmore was kind of split between what his priority should be. His his writing, his fiction career was not at a standstill, but he wasn't. The westerns had ended, but he hadn't really struck gold in the hardcover contemporary sales. But he was making money as a screenwriter, and his agent at the time was a very famous power broker named H.N. Swanson, who recommended that Elmore read a recently published book by George V. Higgins called The Friends of Eddie Coyle. Any listeners that have never read this particular book, find it, because you will see very, very clearly how Elmore was inspired by it and then just ran with it in his own way. It's a crime novel told almost 90% in vernacular dialogue. And Elmore kind of developed a sweet spot where he could use dialogue to carry the story, but also his exposition, when it was there, got very stripped to the bone over time. I think that those are the writers that probably had the most influence that you could see when you read him. And those are the ones that are noted the most. But then afterwards, almost any major crime writer today will probably tell you that they are somehow influenced by Elmore Leonard. I'm convinced of that. Dennis Lehan, Dave Barry, in his crime writing, which you can see. The thing that I loved is getting to go through Elmore's fan letters from over the years. And man, did he get a lot of fan letters from people who were already famous you didn't expect wrote fan letters. Sir Alec Guinness sent him a letter that he loved Get Shorty. Uh,
Amazing.
who's from? Yeah, Donald Fagen from Steely Dan was a huge fan of Elmore's work and wrote him a letter while he was on tour with Steely Dan and said, "Come to our next show." Elton John sent a letter of appreciation to Elmore. He really enjoyed the book Be Cool because it was about the rock industry. One of the ones that was a little bit more obscure but hit home for me was in 1988, 2 months before his passing, the late minimalist Raymond Carver wrote a fan letter to Elmore saying how much he loved the book Glitz.
Oh my God.
And that was tremendous, where in his letter, Carver says, "I need to get away from this minimalist thing." And it's like the thing that he was so known for. He passed away 2 months later, but he had actually written to Elmore saying, "I really love what you're doing." And that was crazy to see that.
Wow.
So it really ran the gamut. And then in his later years, he became friends with other authors. Martin Amis was a tremendous appreciator of his work. They became good friends. And Margaret Atwood as well. Many of Elmore's favorite contemporary writers in his later years were primarily women writers.
Oh, definitely. And we will be talking about many of them throughout these episodes. Chad, let's talk about you. We've got you here. Let's talk about you just a little bit. Might be out of your comfort zone because you are a biographer, but I want to know how you were first exposed to Elmore's work, but also you mentioned your Warren Zevon biography, your John Bonham biography, which are both terrific. What's the through line between those two artists and your biography of Elmore Leonard?
The through line is there's the boring one that's like the pragmatic one, and then like I guess there is a recurring theme. Pragmatic is I'm a fan of all three. I'm a musician for fun. There wasn't the type of biography about Warren Zevon or about John Bonham like the one I wrote. I don't say that with ego. I say that because I'm an avid reader and I love biographies. And there wasn't one in existence in that style of either of those artists. So I kind of like to write what I would end up reading. And Elmore is the big one. He's been my hero since I'm about 11 years old.
Oh,
The
wow.
through line, yeah, yeah. So this was an honor, and getting to reread his entire bibliography and look at it differently. Yeah, this was a blast. The through line is one that I didn't plan for, and I can only talk about it in a small capacity because it's not a major arc of the book. Is that all three of the artists that I've written about just happen to be alcoholics?
Hmm.
And I say that because Elmore conquered it early in his life and probably had the happiest life of the three. But it was interesting writing about artists of different mediums, genres, and each one having to battle that in their own way. Elmore ended up being the most interesting because his work just continued to get better and better to a ripe old age after that. But yes, those were some recurring themes, and I have to add, Warren Zevon was a pretty big fan of Elmore as well.
Oh, interesting. Was Warren from Detroit?
He was born in Chicago, and then he spent the bulk of his life in L.A. But he was a big fan of crime fiction. And when he was ill with cancer, he passed away too young. But when he was dying, he was rereading Rum Punch.
Oof. I mean, other than the cancer, not a bad way to go out. So you've been a fan of Elmore your whole life, but what was the book that brought you into his world, to his work, and is the reason why we're sitting here talking today?
I wish that it was one that wasn't as cliche, but this is where I show my age. I was 11 when uh, Get Shorty the film was going to be coming out, and I'm the youngest of three brothers. I was as excited as them when they started showing trailers for the film, but I also was a bit of a bookworm. So my mother was the one who went to the library and got Elmore's original novel for me, even at that age. So I wouldn't get all the adult humor and everything, but I fell in love with his style of writing and dialogue very, very early. And I started writing little short stories and things like that afterwards. And then at 15, uh, I wrote what I thought was a pretty good first short crime story, which was promptly rejected by Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. And at 15, if at 15 you don't take that very well. So
Oh
I,
man, what was the story about?
it wasn't horrid. I don't think actually it was like a 15-year-old would know anything about this, but it was about a womanizing con man who is shot at the beginning in the opening, and he doesn't know which of the women that he's been deceiving is the one that shot him because they all
Hmm.
have the same first name. I thought it was clever, but I was 15, so there's no real dialogue or any of the gritty stuff. But this was the first one that I took a shot with.
Was this inspired by you having to figure out who to take to the prom?
It was me trying to write like a little old man with glasses in Detroit who I thought was the coolest human being on earth. But that is who I sent it to. And at 15, it was shocking to me that he took me seriously and I got a real response from him. He did a little bit of proofreading of the story, and he wrote a beautiful letter telling of encouragement, words of encouragement, and to keep writing. And what he says, keep writing whether you feel like it or not. So that stayed with me at 15.
That is unbelievable.
Thanks, man. But only one of us got to hang out with him for real.
No,
So
I am super lucky that I got to meet him briefly. I was a co producer of the Freaky Deaky adaptation, and we are definitely going to talk about the book Freaky Deaky as well as the adaptation on the podcast. But during the making of that, I was somehow I got invited to dinner with Elmore at his son and our dear friend Peter Leonard's house, and that was a real thrill to see him in action. And then he came to set a couple of times. Didn't spend too much time on set. I think he just wanted to say hello and have a cigarette under each and every no smoking sign on set. But he never wrote me back and never offered me any encouragement. So that's pretty amazing that he did that for you.
you don't expect that at that age. No, at 15, I remember the big envelope coming with his return address from Bloomfield Hills and everything. And part of what he had put in the packet was as a gift to me. He signed it. Was the short story that he had most recently completed, and it's on his yellow paper and everything. And it was Sparks, which ended up going into the story collection when the women come out to dance,
Mm-hmm.
and that also has the reappearance of Raylan Givens. So that was a very important collection that came out. I met Elmore only once, and it was on his book tour that was about 6 months later. He was touring at the time. This was cool. I remember this so distinctly because I was nervous to meet him. But he was touring with two books at the same time. It was Be Cool, which was his latest release, and it was the first hardcover collection of his westerns. Finally, they were putting out, it was The Tonto Woman and select other westerns, and they were putting them out at the same time. And I got both signed. And when I met him, I was terrified, but he remembered me.
Oh wow,
Yeah, he was just the nicest possible person. Um, but I could barely speak. My late mother, was very pretty, so he gave her the big smile. But I got to shake his hand once, and he did sign both of those books. Those are very treasured items. But he had a fan for life because I wrote every day after that. Getting to meet him the one time was all it took.
that is so great. I mean, I have been lucky enough to get a little bit of encouragement from some folks who are undisputed champions in their field, and it just means so much when you're starting out, and particularly if it's in writing, and you always have it to refer to carry through some moments of doubt, not just in career stuff, but in life. That's wonderful.
It was a big deal. In my 20s, I had one short story when I still was trying for fiction that was published in an e-zine, which I sent to Elmore, and he did send me a letter of congratulations. And he also mentioned that I used 39 exclamation points, and I had to keep that under control. So that was our last correspondence, but I treasure those items. Well, I treasured because I have since donated them to the University of South Carolina, where his archive is. So now they're part of the collection.
That is
And
amazing.
yeah, so writing this book, I don't mean to segue into this, but the university is one of two huge entities that were really responsible for this book taking place. Elmore's archive is at that school. It's at the University of South Carolina. Everyone there is amazing, and there's over 111 boxes of his manuscripts, letters, and I spent over 2 years just reading. It was incredible. The Leonard family, who gave their blessing and participation with the book. You mentioned Peter before. Peter and his brother Bill read every word of this before it was submitted, and their siblings and all the grandchildren. They're just the coolest family. And getting to speak with them afterwards, you can see that Elmore's his playfulness and I think his love of words is kind of hereditary.
Yeah, they are really a joy to be around, and um, I think that's the ultimate success when there are so many people who have done exceptional things and have made exceptional art who are incredibly unhappy people. And so when you have somebody who has done all the great work and work that's going to live on forever, um, but they also had a full life and a great family. I mean, that's
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off, but you touched on something really big. It was interesting writing a biography of someone who had the longest lifespan of any of the subjects. But you just said how someone has such happiness and joy in their life. It is very weird to write about an artist who is happy and successful and doesn't bleed for their work necessarily, but just enjoys the craft. And all the conflict comes out in their product, in the story itself, as opposed to their personal life. That was very weird in a good way to see that as a recurring theme in Elmore's life. He was a very normal family man and likable and and had friends. And
Mm-hmm.
then he would come up with these characters. You know this better than anyone. The characters that he would have created in his books, especially in something like Freaky Deaky, which you were part of the adaptation for. So that writing about that and the creation of how he came up with that was probably one of the most fun things. Most of it was based on life experiences. I mean, his career was over 60 years.
Was it challenging writing about someone who was happy?
That is, it's funny. I was used to writing about miserable. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have to be careful how I phrase that. Rock stars, I think, fall under the heading of just the artist, where there's this. There's a bigger thing, but Elmore wrote about this in his personal notes. There is this belief that there's the starving artist or the artist that has to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And when he got sober, he spoke about this a couple of times. That there's a game that you play where you think you're playing that role, but if you dedicate yourself to the work solely and you find joy in it, it changes your whole life perspective. And there's a very marked difference, I think, when Elmore got clean and sober, the late 70s, and then the clarity and the joy that comes across in his writing afterwards. Because everything before that was great. And if you can imagine it getting better and sharper,
Mm-hmm.
you can see that. And I suppose if there's a comparison with Warren Zevon, when he reached sobriety, his music, especially the lyrics, got so much more complex and intricate. Good went to just great. I think that says a lot about the artist, and I think it says a lot about the fact that maybe substances were hindering instead of inspiring. With Elmore, it never held him back. I mean, 45 novels. Nobody that I spoke to who edited him or worked with him ever saw a marked difference. They just said he kept getting better. That was pretty cool to be able to write about that.
What's it like writing about one of the great wordsmiths of all time?
Challenging. The added pressure was that you can't write a bad book. Now, it's not saying that the book is good or great or anything, but the challenge is that you can't write a bad book about a great writer. It's not like with rock and roll where you're writing about it and you're trying to pay justice to the artist. It's a different medium than they worked in. Elmore was a writer, so the book can't be bad, and it also can't be boring.
Mm-hmm.
It's Judd. It's funny you said that because I did try and keep the 10 rules in mind while writing this, which was kind of ironic, but that was part of a challenge. And I think also that I didn't want to over explain or get too academic in describing his work. I think the one impression I got from Elmore is that he didn't mind being written about, but don't make his work sound boring. I think that's the only thing that might have offended him is that although I think I take an approach to telling the liner notes of his novels, I hope that anybody that reads it wants to go back and visit the real books. I want to entice people to go back and revisit them, and I hope that comes across.
Well, I've been able to read an advance copy, and yeah, I mean, number one, it's awesome, and it's so much fun, and it does make you want to go back and read more, especially if you haven't read them all. Very few people have read all the books. There's 45 plus all the short stories, so there's so much good stuff to revisit, um, and and honestly, some of it is it's because with Elmore you don't have to jump through the hoop of separating the art from the artist. I mean, these days we know so much about so many of our great artists, and we don't like them very much as people. With Elmore, it's sort of the opposite. So you really do feel good going back, knowing that hey, this was someone who tried to be a good person. This is someone who really devoted themselves to their craft and making themselves better and helping other people try to get better at it.
The way you just phrased that is interesting because I think that that's maybe why he was able to bring a very unique empathy to some of the most horrendous characters I've ever read about. He Elmore used to joke in interviews. He'd say something like, "Even my bad guys have mothers," and I love that.
Yeah. I think that empathy that Elmore has for his characters is such a huge reason why they're so compelling. even especially when it's a terrible person. Mark Ricks from Freaky Deaky is a terrible person, but we get him. We understand why he's doing what he's doing. And it's because Elmore shares the full picture of him. And you write really interestingly about Elmore's faith. He grew up a practicing Catholic and was less practicing as his life went on, but that empathy seems to have really been a big part of how he approached his work and his characters. I also want to ask you, I mean, Elmore had his issues with alcohol and he participated in AA. Do you think that maybe going to AA was something that sharpened his empathy?
It's interesting. I think that it might have sharpened it because it sharpens everything. Sobriety sharpens just anything, any faculties you have. But Elmore seems unique because even though his religious practice seems to have faded, not faded, but become more of a lax practice by the late 70s. He was steeped in it in the 50s and 60s
Mm-hmm.
to the point where he was a Eucharistic minister. He taught Sunday school. And those are the times where you look at his Westerns, and even though the characters are not preaching anything, there is a lot of Christian imagery like you would see in perhaps Graham Greene. Okay. And then later on, I don't know if the sobriety necessarily would take the place of religion or spirituality, but the empathy that he had for pretty much every character is what shows through. I was joking with Peter about this, but not really joking because there's been so many adaptations, good, bad, and hopefully just more of
Mm-hmm.
Elmore's work. And I said, people say today, they want more entertainment, more stories that have a diverse cast of characters. All you need to do is adapt any one of Elmore's stories because the diversity is just built in. And I think that's because as he got older and more talented, this is my opinion, he made it a point to try and see through the perspectives of all these different characters and where they're coming from. Because then when he would write it, it's very easy for him to almost leap into the mind from chapter to chapter to give us the POV of those characters so believably. You can only do that when you are empathetic. And even though I don't think his beliefs are ever clearly and bluntly stated, only a writer that has that type of empathy, I think, can create even a likable villain.
Hmm.
Or a character like Raylan Givens, who you know is the good guy, but you do not always agree with the way he's conducting himself.
Mm-hmm.
That gray area exists when the author has a good moral compass, because then they can, I think, then they can play with it within their fictional characters. And if you go by that, every one of Elmore's characters is a little bit of him with tongue in cheek, but I think each one of them has. There's a reason that we can relate to all of them a tiny, tiny bit, even if we don't want to. I think that that's also part of it.
I've got a question for you. It's a little personal, but you've written about three people who had issues with alcohol. What's your relationship with alcohol? Are you a drinker? Are you sober? Do you not drink? Is it
You
around in
can
your
ask me
family?
that. No, no, no. It's I've never had a serious enough problem with any kind of substance where I would relate to that facet of who I write about. I can't go into too much detail with this, but with the first one, which was Warren Zevon, I actually did some research to find out when AA had nights that were open to the public, and they do
Mm-hmm.
that. And I did attend, but identified myself that it was for research purposes, and they knew I was there because I thought that it would be, at the very least, respectful to be able to write about it believably. And that, as being part of the first book, definitely helped with the subject when I had to write about it later. If you're interested, Elmore didn't talk about it very often, but he wrote one magnificent essay about it in the first person, his battle with alcohol, that was in an anthology, which is quoted in my bio.
Mm-hmm.
And then his book Touch is probably his most underrated book. And that deals with the subject itself pretty heavily. And as he said, that's everything I wanted to say is in that one. But it is powerful because the lead character is probably the most, I'm going to say it again, the most empathetic of all characters he ever created. The priest Juvenal, who has the wounds of Christ. He
Stigmata.
bleeds with the, yeah. And that right there was based on one of Elmore's closest friends. Juvenal Carlson was a real guy, a real priest. He had a lot of these positive reinforcements in his life that somehow worked their way into the fiction all through the
No.
years.
Chad, we're here to talk about Elmore, obviously, and we're going to talk more about Elmore, but I'm just curious if you could give us a little bit of your personal background. Where'd you grow up? All that good stuff. You are a character in these proceedings as well. So,
I am originally from Long Island, New York. I'm from Suffolk County, New York, Smithtown.
okay.
And thanks to Elmore Leonard and his wonderful correspondence to me at the age of 15, I was the youngest intern at the Smithtown Messenger throughout high school. And I was a staff reporter there and started doing freelance articles and stringer work into my 20s based on what Elmore inspired in me. I ended up writing nonfiction because I liked the newspaper job, but my letter of recommendation from my English teacher came coupled with Elmore's correspondence. So he helped me a lot
I
at the
would
beginning.
include that in every single job application, marriage application, forever. That's
It was a big
fantastic.
deal at the time. Like I said, he had a fan for life. But that's where I'm originally from, and I went to school for communications and media
Where'd
theory.
you go to school?
Well, I went to a state school, SUNY Empire State College.
God bless.
Oh, thank you. I went back at nights because I was working at the newspaper at the time. And I have worked for MTV, Viacom. I was an assistant speechwriter for the NAACP in Baltimore. I'm trying to sum it up in order.
How does one get a job as a speechwriter?
It was my background in journalism that was the most attractive uh, because I had done copywriting on the side and a lot of political based writing for the papers. That was what was in my portfolio. It's interesting because Elmore was always my hero, and somehow for a while I had gotten really like off track into nonfiction and covering cultural affairs. So it was interesting when I was working for the NAACP and I was living in Baltimore, and one year I had to work the media room at their yearly event in Cincinnati. I was in the hotel in my suit and tie, which is very uncommon for me. And the guitarist Waddy Wachtel walked out of the elevator. That was Warren Zevon's best friend. And I'm wearing a suit and tie, and Waddy's like in his 60s, and he's wearing leather pants, and he's carrying a guitar. And I went, "Oh my God, it's Waddy Wachtel!" And I went up to him and I said, "I don't know if you remember me. I interviewed you over the phone 2 years ago. Blah blah blah." And he just looked at me and said, "Yeah, where's the fucking book?" And that kind of got me buckled down to finish the Warren Zevon book, and then I've only been writing since. But I love the process, and I do keep Elmore's at least his early routine, which is I get up at 5 and I still write early in the day. So
Hmm.
I credit him for that too. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. My wife is from Hungary, and we currently live in Berlin.
Amazing. I love it. I love it all. So while you're writing the Warren Zevon book, you're supporting yourself as a journalist, as a speechwriter. Was there a moment like Elmore had when he made his run, where he walked away from advertising to focus solely on writing fiction, that you dove in with both feet to write these great biographies?
It's funny that I thought of him immediately when that happened. Yeah, because he is the lifelong hero. So I appreciate you making the connection. Well, when I ran into Waddy Wachtel, that got me to buckle down and finish the first book. And my wonderful friend and agent William Clark was able to sell it rather quickly. And the day it sold is when I thought to myself, Elmore's favorite famous line, "I'm going to make my run," which is what he announced to his family when he decided to make a real run for writing and to leave the day job of the copywriting. I thought the exact same thing. I thought of him that day. And that is what I did. I finished the Warren Zevon book, and it came out right before I moved to California and lived at a Buddhist monastery. And COVID happened while I was at the Buddhist monastery, so in quarantine I wrote Beast.
Um,
This is all true.
are you a practicing Buddhist? I'm assuming you are, but tell me about that.
Well, I was exploring. I love world histories and philosophies, so I guess secular Buddhism and meditation is something that I still incorporate into my daily routine. I recommend it for anybody who's in a creative field, any writer. This goes for you too, by the way. Any form of meditation on a daily basis is really excellent for preparing what your agenda is going to be, and that's something that I integrated during that time. And I'll tell you, being at a Buddhist monastery right before COVID and then you're living by yourself really prepares you for the seclusion that's coming for the next year. That happened.
What was that like?
I was very grateful to have the second book to work on during that time. I was also very honored because just prior to that, is when the University of South Carolina had acquired Elmore's archive, and around that time, they had published on their website the PDF of the full collection. And as the super fan that I am, I looked through it just to see what was there because I thought, well, maybe I'll treat myself and go to the college just to see some of Elmore's stuff. There was no book on the horizon. And lo and behold, when I was going through the PDF, he had saved my correspondence to him. And I got very emotional. I'm being honest, I got emotional when I saw that, and I made a trip to South Carolina first and in person met Elizabeth Suddeth, who was in charge of the collection there, and handed over in person my correspondence to Elmore. And there was no concept of a biography yet, except that I felt this very warm feeling of getting to meet everyone that was in charge of his stuff and to get to see some of his collection in person. And I pretty much was getting the feeling that I might want to make a try for a bio of him. So when I finished Beast in California, I wrote to Peter Leonard for the first time because I had read all of his novels as well. Peter's a hell of a novelist. I read his 9 books, and I wrote to him and I said, "Your father meant this to me. I'm a fan of yours. I don't know if you're a Led Zeppelin fan, but if you are, because I know Peter's the same age as my dad. I'm like, if you're a baby boomer, there's a chance you or your brothers like Zeppelin." And
Mhm.
he provided me with a beautiful blurb, and we became friends after that. Then I said, well, if you like the style that I'm writing, do you think maybe I could do this? And it went over really,
Did you
really
say it to him
well.
just like that?
No, it's a little bit more serious when I was getting to know the Leonard family, which is interesting because the more you get to know them, the more fun and goofier they get.
Mm-hmm.
But Peter approved of my writing style, which was a huge compliment. And then when I told him that I was planning to move to South Carolina to immerse myself, he was like, "Are you really moving there?" And I think that that kind of that clinched it.
Wow.
So it was a very different experience also getting to write an authorized biography that's allowed by the estate. The first 2 books, I got, a good luck, best wishes from Warren Zevon's children and from John Bonham's son, Jason, but they
Mm-hmm.
did not take part in the books. This was a very different experience because the Leonard family was hands on. And I think and I'm not just trying to sell it, Judd, that's not what this is, but if you are a fan of his, I think that the biography I aim to maybe like myself, if there are writers out there that look to Elmore for advice, he sprinkled it throughout the way he lived and in every interview. So that's in there. But the warmth of him as a human being, that's something I was not used to about a subject, and that comes through thanks to his family.
100%. That's such a gift. Let's just take a quick step back. So during COVID, you are in LA writing. Is that right?
I
And
was in just outside of San Francisco,
okay.
and then I was there during all of COVID. And just when COVID was starting to lift a little bit and the vaccine had been introduced, is when Beast came out. So I got to make one major bookstore appearance in LA before moving to South Carolina.
Got it. So it's been a while since I've spent any time at all really in a Buddhist monastery. So just give me the lay of the land a little bit. What's a typical day like? Are you
Oh,
uh,
sure.
give
I was
me
part of a program. I was part of a
okay.
program where it was almost like a work and study type of thing. And
Okay.
you learn meditation and core beliefs, and you're part of the temple. But I also was assigned for room and board. You earn your keep
Mm-hmm.
working in the kitchen, and also because of my background as a writer, I worked in the office. But in the evenings, I was able to work on Beast. And I did get one good story that I can share with you out of this that's a lot of fun. I was conducting the interviews for Beast while I was there, and the cover to the book is by one of my favorite rock and roll photographers of all time, Neil Preston.
Okay.
Neil Preston was the official photographer for Led Zeppelin for about a decade. And then when Zeppelin disbanded because of the death of John Bonham, Neil became the official photographer for Queen. So
Hmm.
he did Wembley and Live Aid and all of that. And I got to
Oh
interview
wow.
Neil, who has the best stories imaginable. And he was kind enough to do the cover for Beast. So if you do see it, that's Neil's photo of Bonzo on the cover. It's one of my favorite shots. But at the end of it, we got chummy, and he was a lot of fun. And he said, "Chad, it was fun talking to you. I love talking with rock fans." Blah blah. He said, Where are we talking from?" And I said, I'm interviewing you from my room at a Buddhist monastery." And he laughed and he said, "I never thought I would hear that twice in my lifetime." And I, I said to him, "Who is the first person that said that to you?" And he said, "I was on the phone with Leonard Cohen." And I felt so cool.
Time
And
out. Was Leonard Cohen your roommate at the Buddhist monastery?
no, the late Leonard Cohen practiced Zen, a different form of Buddhism, but he was at a monastery in Los Angeles, and I thought to myself, of course, Neil would know this guy. That made my day that day.
That
Yeah.
is so great. Okay, so you're working in the office at the Buddhist monastery, and you hear about the archives. You head over to University of South Carolina .edu. You're scrubbing through all of the catalog, and then what was it like seeing your
It
name
was a big
there?
deal. Well, I went through, and I'm not trying to necessarily just direct people to it, but there is a treasure trove that's open to the public. There's such a wonderful archive of different authors and their materials. But on the college website, they had a catalog of what you could go see, for researchers. You just have to make a request.
Mm-hmm.
And they have everything. They have Elmore's original, the first few stories he ever wrote for Argosy and 310 to Yuma. And I was just going through this catalog of like the wish list of what I'm going to want to see just to visit. And you get to the correspondence, and then you see the letters from everybody in alphabetical order, and it's all the heavy hitters and other writers and everything. And there's Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Chad Cushins, age 15.
Wow.
And like I said, it doesn't happen often, but I got emotional when I saw that.
Of course.
And his letters to me had been under lock and key for a couple of decades, and that's when I fished them out and called over to the college. As soon as I said that I had something to donate that had to do with the Elmore Leonard collection, I don't think that anybody's ever put my phone call. They put it through very fast.
That's terrific. So you hotwire a car, you drive out, you hand over your contribution. This is during COVID?
It was right before it. I apologize. This was right before COVID, before I had moved. But yeah, that's what I did. I did it in person. I dropped off my letters, the copy of Sparks that Elmore had mailed to me, and it was on that trip that I saw pretty much the same collection and the same archive that he had seen that made him choose that as the final place where he wanted his stuff to go. If you visit the University of South Carolina, they have the archive for James Ellroy. They have one of the biggest Hemingway collections, one of the biggest F. Scott Fitzgerald collections in the United States. They have George V. Higgins, and these are all favorites of Elmore.
Mm-hmm.
So when he saw that this is where his stuff was going to be, it from what Peter told me and from what I heard at the college, it was a very easy choice because his stuff is maintained with the same care. And they have a huge collection of noir and hard-boiled writers, but they handle it for what it is, real literature. And I think it's the idea that they view his stuff as elevated to real literature that made the difference. That's kind of what the point of my book is. So yeah, I'm a big fan of how they handle his materials also. But they were huge in getting this book done.
That's great to hear. Okay, so you're making your run. You finish the Warren Zevon book. Even better, you sell it. What got you interested in writing about John Bonham?
I started to become a fan of Bonham. It's going to sound cliche because if you like rock, almost everybody likes Zeppelin. But
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grow up with Zeppelin as one of my big things. I'm a big jazz fan and real like other classic bands that I grew up with. But I was in a band with my friends and they loved Zeppelin. So I got a deeper appreciation from hanging out with the guys that I was in groups
Sorry,
with.
gotta ask, what was the name of the band and what did you play?
I play keyboards, so I played synthesizer. I played a keytar,
All right.
and the name of the band was The Seeing Things. That is one of the reasons that I did want to write about musicians first. I'm a musician for fun. Elmore and I have a lot of the same favorites. I became a big jazz fan as a kid because he always talked about jazz in his interviews.
Yeah, well, I mean, music
Count
is
Basie.
if music fills his books, which is
In a
it's
big way.
it's
You know,
it's such a
I,
treat.
See, you know Elmore through a relationship based on a film adaptation, and I think that this is something you of all people would appreciate. Now, I know that you got to read Cooler Than Cool, but I don't know if this stuck out to you. One of the things that I didn't know until I was going through Elmore's notes and his papers is he was working on a screenplay in 1970 into 1971 called Jesus Saves. and it was about a televangelist. It eventually morphed into what became the novel Touch.
Mm-hmm.
But in his notes, in his original, it's interesting. He didn't just write a normal screenplay. He would also write, like, he didn't use a normal outline, but he would do a transcript where he would describe the outline as though he were talking to someone in particular, just breaking the fourth wall in his description. Very unique and very fun to read his notes. But he actually says in his notes that music needs to be a character. And that particular story, which was never filmed, took place in 70 to 71. And in his notes, he says that the country music of Bob Dylan and Delaney and Bonnie should saturate the soundtrack like they are characters in the film.
Wow.
And it's amazing to me, he never wrote something that glib in his prose, but I couldn't help but think that maybe that's what he was hearing in the background when
Mm-hmm.
he would write a scene. Little peeks behind the curtain like that were a lot of fun to discover, stuff like that. And that applies to anybody who's a writer. That would apply to any project you work on too. Like, music really was a living thing to him. He just wouldn't always say it.
No, but you can't help but notice how much he knows about music and how much he loves music, and it's the way that he populates his books with music. It's one of the reasons I think why the books do feel so cinematic, is because you're aware of what the characters are listening to, and what they're listening to usually informs them as well, who they are as people. Speaking of great musicians, whether it's Dylan or Warren Zevon or Led Zeppelin, I mean, there is that ability of, no matter what genre, no matter what style, you know who it is. And Elmore had that ability. I
Exactly.
think,
You got it.
regardless of the setting or the time period, you know very quickly it's him. One of the, this is a minor spoiler of the biography, Cooler Than Cool by C.M. Kushins. Elmore bought a small motel in Florida for his mother to run and manage. And you don't go out and say it directly, but this is probably what led to so many of the great books based in Florida being written. La Brava, Cat Chaser, Set in a Hotel, Rum Punch, of course. It is so cool that regardless of where he was always seeking, he was always finding these great characters, these great stories, but no matter what, you always knew it was him.
Yes, and you did grasp onto that very correctly. See, we were talking about the Moonshine War at the very beginning, and it's why I would want to pick that one to go and revisit. That's a perfect example. He started that novel in 1969 around this time of year. It was Christmas time, the week before Christmas of 1969, that he discovered a nonfiction book that set his mind racing towards it. And he threw himself into the project in the same way that you were describing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that was with the Moonshine War, where he actually discovered a part of the United States that he was not familiar with. Up until that point, he had almost exclusively written about the Arizona Territory, his
Mm-hmm.
westerns, and he had completed one contemporary crime novel based in Michigan that had not done well.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's like, there's something about Kentucky, there's something about the American South that I don't think anybody's really written about before. And he became fascinated with the history of it. Within weeks, he had an outline for the Moonshine War ready. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like you said, it's not necessarily that you're seeking, like, I have writer's block, I need something new. It's just he would come upon a topic that would be fresh to him, and his rabbit hole would be to our benefit because it would result in a completely different book. And you see that when he writes to his agent Swanee and says, "I just discovered this nonfiction book, and I think this could lead to something. Let me see what you think." And then just
Mm-hmm.
weeks later, it's sold. So there's lessons in that as well too, where you don't know where the ideas are going to come from. It's that you're receptive to them. And I like what you said, that he always had the same voice. See, that's the thing that's also key. I love his historical novels more than a lot of people. It's not just the mean streets of Detroit or Florida. I love Cuba Libre, The Hot
Mm-hmm.
Kid, Up in Honey's Room, where he would write a historical novel. It could take place in a different country, different era, and in the first page, oh, this is Elmore Leonard.
Right.
It is still the sound. And only a mature writer who's been doing it for so long could have pulled that off.
No, to be able to be yourself, regardless of the setting, the genre, the
It's a
period.
confidence, I think, a
Yeah.
confidence in the sound, and that's got to be the work of someone that just gets up and writes every day, every day, every day, every day. There's a repetition that builds up that sound. He approached it more like a musician,
Hmm.
and that was interesting to see. I know that this could come off as cliche. It's not meant to. I'm a huge jazz fan, and I credit him for that too. I love Miles Davis. Miles Davis went through hard bop, bebop, then all of a sudden modular music, and then it's fusion and this and that. And every time you listen to this and the instrumentation changes and the setting changes, as soon as you hear the trumpet, I know who this is.
Mm.
And it's very much the same way where Elmore would just genre hop and they would bleed into each other. And from the first paragraph, you know the lead instrument is the same guy.
Mm.
And I feel that way reading his books consecutively for this, all 45. You see that it's kind of the same soloist that's playing the whole time.
So, really quickly, what was it about the Bonham book, what you wanted to say in your Bonham book that hadn't been said before?
I hope this doesn't come off as pretentious. I never want to come off that way, especially when you're writing about something as fun. I mean, it's art, but it's also meant to be visceral. So when you start to dissect rock and roll and you take on this academic tone,
Hmm.
you could risk ruining what's so cool and sexy about it to begin with. They were probably writing about rock and roll today is problematic because none of these guys were well behaved. So I have to keep in mind that I wanted to focus on the music. With Warren Zevon and with John Bonham, there was a shared bond that they were the same age, roughly. They were from two different countries, but they were the same genre, different instruments.
Hmm.
Warren was an actual genius. He was an IQ genius and was a classical music prodigy. Bonham, I'm not putting down his intelligence, but he was not known for his articulation. Everything he had to say was through his instrument. So they were the same but different.
Uh-huh.
And it was interesting writing two different rock bios of guys from the same era with the same monkey on the same back, but from totally different backgrounds with totally different results. The only thing I could say, and again, I'm trying not to sound pretentious, is I personally consider those two books companion pieces because Warren Zevon never reached the huge heights of superstardom that he should have, but by getting clean and sober, he had a significantly happier last few years. He got to see his grandchildren. He was sober. He
Hmm.
got he got the critical praise that had eluded him because he had bungled so much with his antics years before. Bonham was on the top of the world and had too much money, and it died. It's so to me, I think everything that I could have learned or have to say about that type of fame is in those two books. And then you have someone like Elmore Leonard, where you're a rock star of a totally different orbit and you got a big smile on your face. And I talked to his sons about that too. I said, I'm not used to having the children of a subject being this open to sharing stories, but at the same time, Elmore never had the same type of press that a rock star would get as far as good and bad
So,
behavior.
Bonham was the drummer for Led Zeppelin, and they were represented by a complete character in his own way named Peter Grant. He is the inspiration for the manager from Spinal Tap, who used to carry around a cricket bat and just sort of a ridiculous person. But he did do great things for Led Zeppelin. And in his own way, he changed the music business, the touring business. He had an amazing, huge impact on really all the bands that followed. One of the big things he did was before Peter Grant, musicians got an appearance fee when they toured, no matter how many people showed up. But he switched it and said, nope, we want 90% of the gate. And that changed the lives of musicians, touring musicians, forever, basically. So, who was Elmore's Peter Grant is what I want to know.
Who might it be?
I love how you phrase it. I love how you phrase it. To be honest with you, writing about Zeppelin, Peter Grant might have been one of the most interesting guys to write about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everything that you just said was accurate. He did. He changed the face of music because people would hate him unless he represented you.
Mm-hmm.
He would bleed for his artists, but if you were not one of them, it was them versus the world. So that he was like the ultimate bulldog, loyal to a T, just you have to be on his side. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that it's as aggressive to this extent, but Elmore had in his life, I mean, he had a number of agents as he got older, but the two primary ones that shaped his career, the first one was Marguerite Harper. And she discovered Elmore upon the publication of his very first short story, his first Western. And she represented him for his entire Western period. And it's interesting how we've forgotten how crucial she was to his career. She only represented male Western writers, and she didn't have an office. She did everything herself. And she was the one who introduced him to H.N. Swanson,
Mm-hmm.
who was the huge power broker agent in Los Angeles who primarily handled television and film. He handled books as well, but she looped him in for TV and film deals around the time of 310 to Yuma. Marguerite Harper died in her early 70s and pretty much handed Elmore over to Swanee, his
Mm-hmm.
nickname. They were together for decades. And it's a little bit like the Beatles getting handed over from their first manager to the second. I can get you this far, and now they're going to handle your superstardom. That's pretty much what happened because Swanee was the one who took all of this early potential that he saw and that Marguerite Harper had shaped and aggressively made the Elmore Leonard that we all read. I mean, I think he was probably a nicer guy than Peter Grant, but that was his Peter Grant.
And after that, he was represented by Michael Siegel, who we're hoping to get on the podcast before too long.
Michael Siegel's a cool guy. Yeah, they first met. This is when I start to feel old. Michael Siegel was in his late 20s when they first met because he worked for Swanee. He's probably got some great stories for you.
Mm.
That was in, I have to double check, that should be in like 92, 93. Swanson himself was in his 80s or 90s and was taking a back seat and was grooming his own team of agents to take over for him. And Elmore was introduced to Michael Siegel, who is probably around the same age as like my oldest brother, and brought a real youthful vigor to his representation. And it's funny because when I was in high school, I collected all of the editions of the Elmore books that were the covers by Chip Kidd with the
Mm-hmm.
cool stamp font and all that. Michael Siegel, Jeff Pasternak, and Andrew Wiley. That's the whole team that did that resurgence in the Renaissance in the '90s. That was those guys, and I collected those. I had all of those when I was a kid.
I have a handful of those. I don't have all of them, but they are great. So I mentioned I was able to read the biography, but I am aware that there was an earlier draft that was considerably longer, and I'm just curious if you might be able to share some of the, maybe the stories, the anecdotes that didn't make the final draft of Cooler Than Cool.
Oh, I'm very happy that I think thank you for asking me that. It was much longer for the primary reason it wasn't laziness. You have to remember that this was a very active and prolific writer who worked nonstop for 60 years. The thing I'm very honored to say, and I'm sorry to have waited this long, is one of the biggest inclusions. There are two exclusives that are in the book that I'd like to share with you, if that's okay. The first one is after I was very honored to have been invited to Peter Leonard's house, like you. I spent a few days in Detroit and met the whole family for roundtable interviews. It was the most incredible experience. And afterwards, Elmore's oldest child, Jane, was impressed enough, and I was really honored by this, but she was impressed enough from our conversations and interviews that she shared with me a bundle of notes and papers that Elmore and she had been assembling towards the end of his life, which would have been the framework for a memoir. That's the first one. And they didn't get far in it, but they were based upon previous speeches that he had given, essays that had never been anthologized, all that would have been put in chronological order to tell certain, like I said, liner notes of his career. And she insisted that I use it for the book.
Holy cow.
So when you read this, there are a wealth of passages in there that are from Elmore's incomplete memoir project, which I was very honored to be allowed to use.
Wow.
And there is actually a brand new poem that will be discovered by Allen Ginsberg dedicated to Elmore that he wrote for him at a party that was originally believed to be lost, but we found it, and it was transcribed by the Allen Ginsberg estate for inclusion.
That's
There's a lot
why.
of cool stuff. Yes, if you love books, I hope you love this one.
Well, it's loving books and also having an understanding and an appreciation of what goes into writing them. One of the things that jumps out is how dedicated he was to the craft, sitting in the chair, keeping his head down, and working. And
Writer's block means you got up from your desk. Elmore Leonard. I live by that. If he has 10 rules, that should be the 11th. He said that more than once. Writer's block means you got up from your desk. I love that.
as we wrap up, I'm curious, what's something that you learned about yourself while writing this book? Had a relationship with him from afar. It was brief, but you did have some interaction with him. What did you learn about yourself as you researched this book about this tremendous writer?
I really appreciate you asking me that. That actually means a lot. I will try not to sound pretentious nor overly philosophical, but I did learn something. And I think it's probably the best advice. I was very happy to discover as I approached the age of 40 that I somehow miraculously had picked the right hero at the right age. And I think it's important. This is going to sound really corny and it's going to make me sound old, but I have thought about this. It is important that at the right age, a kid who's 11, 12, 13, anything like I was, really gets guidance to pick which hero they're going to want to emulate. And with Elmore, I think of was Carl Sagan and his prodigy. I'm trying to think. Neil deGrasse Tyson. He talked about how he met Carl Sagan once, and he said he gave me a tour of the lab, and he signed a book for me. And I'm paraphrasing, but he says, when I met Carl Sagan, I already knew I wanted to be an astronomer, but after I met him, I knew what type of person I wanted to be. And I completely relate to the one exchange I had with Elmore Leonard, and I learned after all this time that I had picked the right hero and how important that really is at the right age. I hope that comes across, because anybody who does that, we can be very muddled over the people that we select as role models, but every once in a while we're lucky and we pick the right one. And I think that's him, one of the good guys.
He absolutely was. He absolutely was. Thank you again for writing this great biography. Such great perspective. I obviously don't know him well, but I think he would have gotten a kick out of it.
I hope he'd read the whole thing. It's a little long for him.
Well, it's not just that. I couldn't help but notice that there's about 754 exclamation points in this page.
Yeah, exactly. I was waiting. Yeah. Yeah, so you can do that now. Thank you, Judd.
Oh my God. Thank you, Chad. Cooler Than Cool comes out this October, right about the time that Elmore would have turned 100. We've just sort of scratched the surface on the biography and how great it is and some of the stories. So hopefully, Chad, you'll be able to join us again. We're going to be talking about the biography a lot. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is a blast. I hope you keep this going. I could talk about Elmore forever, and I love listening to people do the same thing. It's always great to hear more fans.
The Elmore Leonard podcast is produced and edited by Judd Rubin. Music by Greg Ahee. Hosted by Judd Rubin and Alex Leonard. Executive produced by Peter Leonard. Copyright 2025, Elmore Leonard Inc. Please visit us at elmoreleonardofficial.com or send us an email at hello@theelmoreleonardpodcast.com.